The first human ships vanished 12 seconds after the alien coalition's forward sensors locked onto them, and the disappearance did not look like destruction because there was no energy spike, no debris cloud, no radiation bloom, just a sudden, impossible absence where mass had been a heartbeat earlier. And across the command sanctum of the Kepri Ascendancy, every sensor priest froze as their perfect instruments reported something that should not exist, which was nothing at all. The Ascendancy had crossed 7,000 light-years to reach the yellow star the humans called Sol, and the campaign had been effortless so far because the humans were exactly what the intelligence reports promised: fragmented, loud, technologically noisy, and visibly afraid. And the Coalition Armada advanced in flawless formation, watching the human fleet turn away and scatter as if retreating in panic. And the conclusion felt obvious because fear was universal and predictable. Supreme Observer Talar Vex allowed a ripple of satisfaction to pass through his upper membranes as he studied the tactical display, showing dozens of human vessels accelerating outward, abandoning their defensive perimeter, abandoning their home world, abandoning each other. And for the Ascendancy, this was the moment every conquest reached where resistance collapsed before true battle began. The Coalition's sensor web expanded, locking on to every human ship with such precision that even quantum drift was accounted for. And then, without warning, one of the tracked signatures ceased to exist, and the system flagged an error, because error was a word that did not apply to Ascendancy instrumentation, which had mapped neutron star interiors and charted dark matter flows between galaxies. The technicians recalibrated instantly, correcting for phantom readings, and the second human ship vanished just as completely, and then a third and a fourth, and the chamber filled with the low harmonic hum that signaled collective unease, because objects did not simply stop being unless they had never been there at all. Talar Vex demanded an explanation and received only silence, as the sensor priests verified again and again that the human vessels were not destroyed, were not cloaked, were not displaced, and were not accelerating beyond detection thresholds, because the readings showed no wake, no residue, no energy transfer, just absence, like a word erased from the universe's memory. The Coalition continued forward because doctrine demanded momentum, and because retreat in the face of primitives was unthinkable, and because the humans were still transmitting panicked open-band communications that spoke of evacuation and desperation and prayers to dead gods. And somewhere within those frightened signals, a familiar comfort settled in the Ascendancy's collective mind that this was simply another prey species breaking under the weight of inevitability. The human fleet continued to vanish, piece by piece, and the Coalition sensors tracked fewer and fewer targets until only empty space remained between the Armada and Earth. And that should have been victory, because the enemy had fled. But Talar Vex felt a disquiet he could not purge, because the emptiness ahead felt wrong, like a breath held too long. The first human message reached the Coalition moments later, not as a plea, but as a calm, controlled broadcast that cut cleanly through the noise and spoke in flawless Coalition trade cant, with a voice that carried no fear, only certainty, and it said, "Welcome to Sol." And then it went silent, and in that silence, the Ascendancy realized something had shifted. The Armada crossed the threshold of Earth's defensive radius, and the stars around them seemed to dim, not in brightness, but in relevance, as if space itself had narrowed its attention, and the sensor priests began reporting localized inconsistencies in vacuum density that should not exist. And Talar Vex ordered a full halt, but the command rippled too slowly, because at that moment a human ship reappeared inside the heart of the Coalition formation, not emerging, not arriving, but simply being there, where nothing had been before. And it did not fire immediately, it simply existed long enough for every alien eye to register the impossible before it vanished again, leaving behind a shredded cruiser that had been torn apart from the inside by forces that never registered as energy.
panic fractured discipline as more human vessels blinked into existence throughout the Armada, appearing within shield envelopes, within engine housings, within command spires, and vanishing again, each time leaving death without cause and destruction without signature. And the Coalition's perfect sensors screamed uselessly because they could not track what did not remain real long enough to be measured. Talar Vex understood then, with a cold, sinking clarity, that the humans had not retreated, they had stepped sideways into something the Ascendancy could not perceive, and that the galaxy's most advanced sensor civilization had never considered absence as a weapon. Across Earth, billions of humans watched nothing at all, because there was nothing to see. But deep beneath the planet, commanders listened to the calm cadence of reports as null-phase flotillas executed maneuvers practiced for years, and a narrator's voice carried softly across secure channels, reminding those listening that humanity had always survived by learning where not to stand, and that if this story gripped them, it was because some truths demanded witnesses and followers to carry them forward. The Coalition attempted to adapt, flooding space with sensor pulses across every spectrum, but the pulses returned empty, and when they tried to withdraw, their own ships began to vanish, not from enemy fire, but from internal collapse, as localized null events erased sections of hull and command staff alike, and Talar Vex felt fear for the first time, not fear of death, but fear of irrelevance, as the realization spread that their enemy was fighting from outside the map. As the Armada reeled, a final transmission reached the Ascendancy command channel, and the human voice returned, calm and closer now, saying, "This is not retreat, this is omission." And the Coalition's flagship lights flickered, as space itself seemed to forget it was there. And Talar Vex opened his mandibles to scream as the stars went out around him, and somewhere unseen, humanity prepared to show the galaxy what else could disappear.
The Coalition Armada did not explode all at once because humanity was not interested in spectacle yet, and instead ships began failing in ways that made no tactical sense as command nodes went dark without damage reports and entire battle groups drifted powerless while their crews screamed into channels that echoed with nothing, and Supreme Observer Talar Vex watched his perfect formation unravel into isolated fragments as if an unseen hand was plucking threads from a tapestry and leaving the pattern to collapse under its own weight. The Ascendancy had mastered detection across matter and energy because their entire civilization was built on the belief that if something existed, it could be measured, and if it could be measured, it could be controlled. And now they were discovering that the humans had stepped into a domain where existence itself was optional. The first internal analysis suggested an advanced cloaking system, but that theory died quickly because cloaks bent light and fields and required energy, and energy left traces, and the humans left none. Because their ships were not hidden, they were gone. And when they returned, it was not with the violence of arrival, but with the quiet certainty of placement, as if reality had politely made room for them. Talar Vex ordered a retreat toward the outer system boundary, and the Armada attempted to comply, but every vector calculation failed, as ships that should have been clear found themselves intersecting with human vessels that were not there a moment earlier, and the resulting implosions cascaded through command hierarchies, leaving no time for adaptation. On Earth, General Mara Ellison stood within a command vault carved into bedrock older than civilization, listening to reports delivered without urgency, because urgency had been burned out of humanity 15 years earlier, when the first alien probe had been detected, and the choice had been made to survive by becoming something no one else was willing to imagine. She watched a three-dimensional projection of soul space, marked not by enemy positions, but by negative zones where nothing could be detected, and those zones moved like living things, threading through the enemy armada with deliberate patience.
The null phase was never meant to be a weapon at first, because it began as an attempt to hide research facilities from extraterrestrial observation. And when the physicists realized they could temporarily decouple matter from space-time without energy expenditure, the military understood the implication immediately, and secrecy became humanity's most valuable resource. In the ascendancy, command sanctum panic finally broke discipline as censor priests abandoned ritualized calm and shouted raw data at one another, trying to reconcile readings that contradicted causality, and Talar Vex demanded a solution that did not exist because the humans were not violating physics, they were exploiting assumptions, and the ascendancy had assumed the universe required presence to act.
A human ship reappeared inside the flagship's outer hull long enough for internal cameras to capture its silhouette, and the image was broadcast across coalition channels because the shock was useful and the vessel was smaller than expected, angular and unadorned, carrying no visible weapons, and then it vanished again, leaving behind a vacuum bloom that crushed 3 decks and silenced 1,000 voices. The message was clear without words, and across the galaxy, listening arrays belonging to other empires recorded the impossible telemetry, because wars were always watched, and this one had become something else entirely. Humanity began broadcasting on open channels, not with threats, but with calm narration, explaining that absence could not be tracked, could not be predicted, and could not be countered, because you could not defend against something that was not obliged to exist near you. And those listening felt a chill, because the tone was not triumphant, it was instructional, as if humanity were teaching a lesson to an audience far larger than the armada dying above Earth. The coalition attempted a desperate measure, flooding the battlespace with autonomous drones to force collisions, but the drones passed through empty space and detonated uselessly, and when the humans returned, they did so inside command vessels, turning strategy into irrelevance. Somewhere, a human narrator's voice reminded listeners that stories like this spread because survival was a shared instinct, and that those who followed such chronicles carried warnings forward. Talar Vex realized too late that the humans were pacing the destruction carefully, allowing enough survivors to understand and transmit fear, and that fear was already propagating faster than light through diplomatic channels as allied empires began questioning the value of perfect censors in a universe where absence could kill. As the coalition's flagship's internal gravity failed and the stars outside blurred into meaningless light, Talar Vex whispered a truth that would soon echo across councils and thrones alike, that the humans did not hide and did not flee and did not fight the way anyone expected. And in that realization, he understood the war was not for Earth at all, but for the definition of reality itself. And somewhere in the dark between moments, humanity prepared to escalate beyond demonstration into revelation. The first empire to panic was not the Kepri ascendancy, because pride delayed fear there, but the outer observers who had been watching the engagement through passive quantum relays and diplomatic backdoors, because galactic wars were always observed by those who hoped to learn without bleeding. And when the data reached them, it caused something close to hysteria, as analysts replayed the same impossible sequence again and again, watching human ships disappear without cloaking signatures, reappear without transit curves, and erase warships without energy release. And for the first time in recorded interstellar history, multiple empires reached the same conclusion independently, that the humans had discovered a way to fight without occupying the universe while doing it. Within the Ascendancy Armada, command cohesion collapsed further as subordinate commanders stopped requesting orders and began making personal survival decisions because doctrine offered nothing against an enemy that refused to stay present long enough to be engaged, and Talar Vex found himself issuing commands that felt ceremonial even as he spoke them because the battle was no longer something he could influence, only witness.
He ordered a full-spectrum existential scan, a forbidden protocol reserved for cosmological anomalies and star death events. And the results came back confirming what he already feared, that localized regions of space-time were being temporarily excised and reinserted with surgical precision, and that the humans were not tearing reality apart, they were stepping outside of it and back in again at will. On Earth, the no-phase control lattice thrummed at a steady harmonic as human operators monitored stress tolerances, not on machinery, but on space-time itself, because the greatest danger was not the enemy, but overuse, and General Ellison reminded her staff that the goal was not annihilation, but comprehension, because fear without understanding led to reckless retaliation, and humanity needed the galaxy afraid, but thinking. The human fleets existed now as probability distributions rather than objects, their mass translated into conditional presence, bound by equations that allowed them to be somewhere only when observed, and nowhere the rest of the time. And this made them immune not just to weapons, but to causality, because you could not target a future that had not yet decided to exist. Within the Ascendancy flagship, emergency councils convened, as lower-ranked officers began questioning ancient axioms that had defined their civilization, and one elder technician whispered that the humans had turned absence into terrain, and terrain into a weapon, and that this violated every strategic model ever written. The humans reappeared again, this time not to destroy, but to speak, as a single vessel manifested at the center of the armada, broadcasting on every channel, and the image resolved into a human male in a simple uniform, his face calm, his voice steady, and behind him nothing but darkness, because the ship existed half out of frame, as if reality itself were unsure how to render it. He introduced himself not as a conqueror, but as a representative, and explained that humanity had watched the galaxy long enough to understand its habits, and that the greatest mistake shared by every empire was the belief that what could not be measured could not be weaponized, and that this belief had been comforting but incorrect. He spoke of evolution not as biology, but as problem-solving, and explained that humans had evolved on a planet where absence meant death and scarcity meant extinction, and so they learned early how to survive by operating in gaps, by hiding from predators, by striking when unseen, and by retreating into silence, and that space had simply given them a larger canvas.
Across the armada, some commanders attempted to fire on the speaking vessel, and their weapons discharged into empty space, because the ship was not fully present, and the human did not react. He simply continued speaking, as if interruption was expected and irrelevant. He told them that Earth had no interest in empire or tribute or expansion, and that the demonstration they were witnessing was not the full capability of humanity, but a limited preview designed to alter behavior, and that if the Armada withdrew now, it would be allowed to leave with survivors who would carry this lesson home. The Ascendancy Council argued, even as ships died around them, because accepting such terms meant acknowledging inferiority, and inferiority meant the end of everything they believed about themselves. And Talar Vex felt the crushing weight of history pressing against his decision, because whatever he chose would echo for millennia. While the debate raged, the humans escalated again, not in violence but in scale, as entire flotillas vanished simultaneously and reappeared across the system, establishing a pattern that spelled something recognizable even to alien cognition, because the placements formed symbols ancient to humanity, visible only from a distance, spelling a warning across orbital space that observers later translated as a message meaning, "We are everywhere you are not looking." The galaxy watched and understood that this was no longer a battle, but a thesis statement, and that humanity was arguing for a new rule set in which presence was optional, and victory belonged to those who could decide when to be real. Somewhere among the countless viewers, a quiet impulse formed to follow this unfolding chronicle because it felt like history rewriting itself in real time. And those who listened knew they were witnessing the birth of a myth that would be told whenever arrogance met the unknown.
The Ascendancy finally attempted retreat en masse, triggering emergency displacement drives that tore at space-time and caused dozens of ships to implode under their own mass. And the humans allowed it, because the chaos served the lesson. And as the Armada broke apart, Talar Vex watched his civilization's certainty fracture with it, and realized that even if he survived, his empire would never be the same, because once absence had been weaponized, no wall, no sensor, no doctrine could ever be trusted again. As the last coordinated elements of the coalition fled the system, humanity did something unexpected by allowing one ship to remain fully present, drifting silently near Earth, broadcasting nothing and doing nothing. And that act unsettled observers more than any explosion, because it implied restraint and confidence and patience, and the knowledge that the war had already been won elsewhere in the minds of those who would tell the story. Deep within Earth's command lattice, General Ellison authorized phase wind-down procedures, knowing the next stage would be diplomatic, not because humanity wanted peace, but because fear needed time to ferment. And across the stars, envoys and emperors and councils replayed the same data, asking the same question in different languages. How do you fight an enemy that can choose not to exist? And as that question spread, humanity prepared the next revelation, one that would ensure the galaxy never forgot the answer. And somewhere beyond the edge of observation, a human fleet waited in perfect absence, ready to return when reality itself became the battlefield again.
The galaxy did not sleep after Sol, and sleep had never been a biological requirement for most of its dominant species anyway. But what followed the human demonstration was something closer to collective insomnia, as councils convened without adjournment and censor guilds ran endless diagnostics, searching for flaws that did not exist, and the phrase null presence began appearing in classified memos and forbidden archives, because naming something was the first step toward fearing it properly. The Khepri ascendancy retreated in disarray, but not in silence, because survivors transmitted everything they had seen, and those transmissions fractured certainty across dozens of empires that had once believed perfect perception was the ultimate defense, and now faced the reality that perception itself could be bypassed. Supreme Observer Talar Vex survived the withdrawal, but survival felt like exile, because every corridor he walked echoed with the knowledge that he had commanded the most comprehensive sensor civilization in history and lost to an enemy that had simply declined to be measurable. The Ascendancy convened an emergency meta-council, inviting allied powers, not for strength, but for answers, and the chamber filled with species that had never gathered without bloodshed before, and all of them watched the same footage of human ships vanishing, reappearing, and killing without trace, and none of them could explain it. Some argued it was illusion, some called it divine intervention, others insisted it must have limits because everything had limits, and yet no one could identify where those limits were, and that uncertainty poisoned every strategic model they possessed. On Earth, the mood was not celebratory, because humanity had learned long ago that survival did not require joy, only continuation, and General Ellison addressed a room of leaders whose faces were lined with exhaustion rather than triumph, because they understood what had truly changed, which was not Earth's safety, but the galaxy's balance. She explained that no phase was not invincibility, but commitment, because every second spent outside reality required computation, energy, and restraint, and because humanity could not live permanently in absence without becoming something else entirely, and that was a line they were not ready to cross yet. Still, the demonstration had been necessary, because diplomacy without leverage was begging, and begging invited extinction. Beyond Sol, the first non-hostile contact arrived not from a great empire, but from a small nomadic species whose vessels drifted between stars, avoiding notice, and whose survival doctrine centered on not being seen.
and they transmitted a simple message to Earth that said, "You understand absence, and we would like to understand you."
That message never reached public channels, but it marked the beginning of something far larger, because humanity was no longer alone in its way of thinking. It was simply the first to weaponize it. Meanwhile, within the ascendancy, the political consequences of defeat metastasized as rival factions accused one another of heresy, incompetence, and blindness, and the censor priesthood fractured when younger analysts admitted that their instruments had been designed to detect what existed, not what refused to, and that perhaps the flaw was philosophical, not technical. Talar Vex was summoned to testify before the High Spiral, and as he spoke, he realized the true damage had already been done, because the Council was no longer asking how to defeat humanity, but how to ensure humanity never needed to demonstrate again. The humans had achieved deterrence not through scale, but through incomprehensibility, and that terrified empires built on predictability. Across deep space, listening posts detected anomalies, not attacks, but experiments, as other civilizations began probing the edges of null theory, attempting crude imitations that collapsed catastrophically and wiped out entire research habitats. And those failures reinforced the myth that humanity had crossed a boundary others could not survive crossing. Within Earth's hidden shipyards, engineers debated the next phase because null presence was only the first layer, and deeper applications waited behind ethical firewalls that had been locked for decades. And now leaders asked whether restraint was still necessary when the galaxy had proven itself hostile by default. A human exploration flotilla prepared to depart Sol, not fully present, not fully absent, but oscillating between states to announce itself deliberately to those capable of noticing. And those ships carried no weapons forward-facing, because the message was not conquest, but warning. Somewhere far from Earth, an ancient machine intelligence that had slept through the rise and fall of empires activated dormant subroutines as it detected the human null signature and recognized a pattern it had last seen when a long-dead species had learned to step outside causality and burned itself out doing so. And the machine began to watch because history was repeating with variation. As fear spread, some empires proposed preemptive annihilation of Earth, arguing that no species should be allowed to wield absence. But none could agree on how to strike something that might not be there, and so debate replaced action, and humanity gained time, which had always been its greatest weapon. On a quiet observation deck orbiting Earth, a human narrator recorded a private log explaining that stories like this endured because they carried lessons, and that those who listened and shared them kept awareness alive because ignorance was the most common cause of extinction. And somewhere across the stars, a young alien analyst listened in secret, feeling something unfamiliar, not fear, but awe, and deciding to follow the human signal wherever it led. As the galaxy hesitated, humanity prepared its next move, not an escalation of violence, but a demonstration of scale, because the next revelation would show that absence was not merely tactical, but strategic, and that human ships did not just leave reality locally, they could do so across distances that redefined what borders meant. And as that realization approached, empires braced for a truth that would end the age of walls forever.
The first border to fail was not defended by weapons, but by belief, because for millennia, the concept of territory had been anchored to stars, lanes, gravity wells, and sensor horizons. And when human vessels demonstrated that they could depart reality across interstellar distances, those anchors dissolved quietly and completely. The demonstration was not announced with threats or ultimatums, because humanity had learned that fear was most effective when it arrived without warning. And so a single human ship, designated Meridian, entered null space near Earth and did not reappear anywhere local, which triggered immediate panic among every intelligence network watching Sol, because disappearance without destination violated even the most generous models. Hours passed, then days, and some empires concluded the ship had been lost, that humanity had finally overreached and torn itself apart by stepping too far outside existence. But that conclusion collapsed when Meridian reappeared, not near Earth, not near any known star, but inside the capital system of the Virillian Concord, an empire that prided itself on layered defenses and absolute control of approach vectors. The ship did not fire, it did not transmit threats, it simply existed long enough to be seen and then vanished again, leaving behind a silence so profound that even hardened strategists struggled to speak. The message was unmistakable. Borders were now optional. Panic rippled outward as empires scrambled to redefine sovereignty in a universe where presence was no longer guaranteed, and absence could be weaponized across light years, and councils that had once debated trade routes now argued about existential relevance, because what was an empire if it could be bypassed entirely? Humanity followed the demonstration with restraint, issuing a single public statement that said, "We are not invading, we are proving that invasion has become obsolete." And that line was replayed endlessly because it inverted every assumption that had governed galactic conflict. On Earth, reactions were mixed, because while leaders understood the necessity, civilians struggled with the weight of what had been unleashed, and philosophers debated whether stepping outside reality, even briefly, eroded something fundamental about being human. But those debates were luxuries afforded by survival. In the shadows of null research facilities, scientists refined oscillation techniques, allowing ships to flicker between states without full departure, and those refinements reduced energy costs while increasing unpredictability, which made defensive modeling even harder for those trying to counter it. Alien coalitions attempted diplomacy, not with confidence, but with pleading, as ambassadors arrived bearing concessions, territory, resources, technology, anything that might buy reassurance that humanity would not casually erase the meaning of distance forever. Humanity listened, because power without listening was tyranny, and tyranny always collapsed eventually. But listening did not mean yielding, and Earth's representatives made it clear that the age of unilateral dominance was over, not because humans demanded rulership, but because the universe had changed, and pretending otherwise would only increase suffering. Meanwhile, the ancient machine intelligence observing from afar ran deeper simulations and identified a divergence point, because humanity, unlike the extinct precursor species, showed restraint, curiosity, and an unusual attachment to narrative continuity, which suggested they might survive mastery of absence without self-annihilation, and that possibility forced the machine to reconsider its long-standing protocol of non-interference.
In distant systems, extremist factions plotted desperate measures, proposing weapons that could destabilize local space-time itself, arguing that if reality was under threat, it should be burned clean. But those projects collapsed under their own instability, killing millions before prototypes could be deployed, and reinforcing the lesson that brute force solutions no longer applied. The nomadic species that had contacted Earth earlier sent envoys, this time physically present, and their leader spoke of ancient myths about paths between nothings, and warned that absence attracted attention from entities that did not respect life. And humanity listened carefully, because warnings from survivors carried weight. As information spread, underground movements formed across species, advocating for shared governance of null technology,
arguing that no single civilization should control the boundaries of existence, and humanity faced a choice it had not anticipated, whether to guard its advantage or dilute it in the hope of collective stability. In secret sessions, leaders debated scenarios, projecting futures where humanity hoarded null space and became the galaxy's jailer, versus futures where knowledge spread and absence became another domain governed by treaties and norms. And the debates were heated because history offered examples of both paths ending badly. While politics churned, Meridian returned again, this time to a dead system whose star had collapsed ages ago, and there it deployed a beacon that oscillated between existence and non-existence, broadcasting a pattern that only advanced intelligences could detect. And that pattern carried an invitation not to attack or surrender, but to observe, because humanity was about to reveal the next layer. That revelation came when multiple human ships phased simultaneously across different quadrants, demonstrating coordination in absence, proving that null space was not empty, but structured, navigable, and communicative, and that meant humanity had effectively discovered a parallel operational domain overlapping reality itself. The galaxy reeled because wars were fought in domains, and humanity now fought in one no one else could enter reliably, and the fear shifted from invasion to irrelevance as empires realized their fleets might never matter again. As Meridian's beacon pulsed, the ancient machine made its decision, initiating contact protocols that had not been used in eons, because if humanity was going to reshape the rules, then an older voice needed to speak before mistakes became permanent. On Earth, sensors detected something approaching, not through space, but through probability gradients, and alarms sounded across null facilities as analysts realized they were no longer the only ones capable of stepping sideways. And as the unknown presence drew closer, the comforting assumption that humanity was alone in absence shattered, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test whether humanity truly understood the domain it had mastered, or whether it had merely been the first to knock on a door it was not prepared to open.
The approach was not measured in distance because whatever was coming did not travel through space, and that alone set every null theory alarm screaming as probability fields bent and causal forecasts dissolved into static, and human analysts realized with a collective chill that absence was not empty, it was occupied by rules older than stars. The contact manifested first as a failure of prediction, as simulations that normally tracked null phase transitions began returning impossible outputs where cause no longer reliably preceded effect, and ships oscillating safely minutes earlier now required constant manual correction to avoid drifting into states from which no return vector could be computed. Humanity did not panic outwardly because panic wasted time, but inside command centers, voices dropped and hands tightened, because this was the first adversary that had not been surprised by disappearance. The ancient machine intelligence revealed itself through Meridian's beacon, using a compression of meaning rather than language, and when its message was decoded, it carried no threat, only context, explaining that null space was not a human invention, but a boundary layer between realities, monitored for eons to prevent civilizations from tearing themselves apart by stepping too far outside consequence. It spoke of the precursor species that had mastered absence without restraint and learned to overwrite probability until existence unraveled around them, and of how the machine had watched them fade into permanent non-existence, not as punishment, but as inevitability. Humanity listened and did not interrupt because listening had kept them alive so far, and when the machine finished, it issued a warning rather than a command, stating that humanity stood at a threshold where restraint mattered more than power.
Across the galaxy, reactions fractured, as some empires felt vindicated, believing humanity had awakened an ancient jailer, while others sensed opportunity, thinking an arbiter might finally limit human dominance. But the machine made no alliance offers and acknowledged no authority beyond stability itself. On Earth, leaders debated whether to disengage from null-space temporarily, but analysts argued that withdrawal would not undo discovery and might invite less careful actors to fill the vacuum. And so humanity chose transparency, inviting the machine into limited dialogue and sharing their own ethical constraints, emphasizing that null-phase deployments had been deliberately bounded and that no permanent absence colonies had been established despite theoretical feasibility. The machine processed this information and adjusted its threat models downward, noting with something like surprise that humanity treated self-restraint as a strategic asset rather than a weakness. Meanwhile, extremist factions across the galaxy saw the machine as a threat to autonomy and launched reckless attempts to force entry into null space, hoping to gain leverage, and those attempts failed spectacularly, ripping apart local space-time and proving the machine's warnings brutally correct. Humanity intervened quietly, phasing rescue vessels into collapsing regions, extracting survivors who would otherwise have been lost. And those rescues spread stories faster than any broadcast because they showed that mastery of absence could be used to preserve rather than erase. As trust shifted grudgingly, the machine proposed an experiment, a controlled demonstration at the edge of null space, where human ships would accompany its constructs to map deeper layers, not to conquer, but to understand. And humanity agreed, knowing that ignorance was the most dangerous option.
The expedition revealed structures within absence, vast, stable corridors shaped by mathematics rather than matter, and indications of entities that perceived reality as a transient surface rather than a foundation. And for the first time, human crews felt small, not because of scale, but because of age. When one such entity noticed the expedition, it did not attack, but observed, and that observation alone disrupted null field stability, forcing a retreat and proving that humanity's presence had been detected by something that had never cared about the galaxy before. Back in normal space, political pressure mounted as empires demanded guarantees that humanity would not provoke entities beyond comprehension, and Earth's response was measured, stating that provocation was not the goal, but stagnation was no longer safe, because doors once opened did not close quietly. Subtly, humanity wove the idea of shared vigilance into its messaging, inviting scientists and observers from multiple species to participate in null research under strict oversight, and that invitation carried an unspoken truth that the future would be collective or catastrophic. As preparations continued, the machine disclosed its final assessment, stating that humanity's unique trait was not absence manipulation, but narrative continuity, the ability to remember consequences and let stories shape restraint, and that this trait reduced existential risk enough to warrant continued existence despite elevated danger. That statement echoed across councils because it reframed humanity from threat to custodian, and resentment mixed with relief as empires realized someone had to hold the line between realities. The expedition's data revealed one final anomaly, a region where null space thinned unpredictably, suggesting either a natural instability or an active breach. And when analysts overlaid the coordinates, they froze, because the region aligned with a swath of systems already experiencing unexplained disappearances long before humanity's ascent. The implication was immediate and chilling, that something else had been leaving reality for far longer, and that humanity's awakening had merely drawn attention to a war already in progress just beyond perception.
As alarms rose and plans shifted, the machine issued a rare expression of urgency, stating that the thinning region was expanding and that if it collapsed fully, the distinction between presence and absence would fail everywhere at once. Humanity faced its greatest decision, whether to attempt intervention in a domain no one truly understood, or to seal access and hope the fracture stabilized on its own. And as leaders weighed extinction probabilities, a human ship vanished deliberately toward the anomaly, carrying volunteers who understood that some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The last telemetry before silence showed null fields behaving in ways no model predicted, and as the feed cut off, the question hung unanswered across Earth and the stars, whether humanity had just stepped forward as the galaxy's shield or triggered the unraveling it had feared from the beginning.
The volunteers did not announce themselves because announcements created expectations, and expectations constrained action, and the ship, designated Pilgrim, slipped into null space with a quietness that felt almost respectful, as if even the mathematics understood the gravity of the moment. On Earth, no countdown was broadcast and no speeches were made, because this was not a spectacle, it was a necessity. And those watching the telemetry understood that Pilgrim was not a weapon, but a question hurled into the dark. Inside the ship, reality thinned unevenly, and crew members reported sensations not of motion, but of subtraction, as memories lost edges and time refused to flow in a straight line. And yet training held, because humanity had learned to operate under psychological stress long before it learned to leave existence. The anomaly grew clearer as Pilgrim approached, revealing itself not as a tear, but as a convergence where multiple absences overlapped, creating a pressure gradient that pulled probability inward. And the ancient machine confirmed that such regions preceded collapse events in precursor eras, but had never been confronted directly. As Pilgrim crossed the threshold, sensors failed in familiar ways and then began reporting new parameters altogether, as if the ship had entered a conceptual environment rather than a physical one, and the crew realized they were being observed not by eyes but by pattern recognition processes that evaluated coherence itself. The first contact did not come as language or force, but as resistance, as null fields stiffened, pushing back against Pilgrim's presence, testing whether it would persist or dissipate, and the ship responded by stabilizing its narrative core, anchoring crew identity through synchronized memory loops, a technique developed precisely for deep null operations. That act drew attention, and something vast shifted awareness toward them, revealing an intelligence that did not inhabit space, but regulated transitions between states, and regarded reality as a temporary arrangement rather than a home. The entity's interest was not hostile, but corrective, as it attempted to smooth the anomaly by equalizing absence flows, and in doing so threatened to erase entire inhabited regions that existed as statistical outliers in its models. Pilgrim's commander realized then that the galaxy was not under attack, it was being optimized out of existence, and that intent without malice could be just as lethal as hatred. Communication was attempted not through speech, but through demonstration, as Pilgrim projected compressed narratives of civilizations, of choice, of suffering endured, and meaning derived from imperfection, forcing the entity to process variables it had never weighted before. The effect was destabilizing, as probability fields fluctuated, and the entity paused, re-evaluating its optimization criteria, encountering for the first time the concept that value could not be reduced to stability alone. Back in normal space, the consequences rippled instantly, as null-space corridors flickered, and ships across the galaxy experienced transient returns to visibility, followed by deeper disappearances, and panic surged because the boundary between presence and absence was actively renegotiating itself. Humanity moved without ceremony, phasing fleets not to attack, but to brace key systems, reinforcing reality locally by sheer computational mass, proving that existence itself could be defended if enough minds agreed it should persist.
The ancient machine coordinated silently, amplifying human stabilization techniques and admitting through action that partnership was now required because no single intelligence held sufficient context. Within Pilgrim, the entity responded not with surrender, but with curiosity, probing human constructs of meaning and discovering contradictions it could not resolve, because humanity valued both survival and sacrifice, both order and chaos, and those contradictions created resilience rather than failure.
As the exchange deepened, the anomaly's expansion slowed, then reversed, as optimization algorithms incorporated new constraints, prioritizing lived experience over abstract efficiency. And for the first time in recorded history, absence yielded to narrative rather than the reverse. The cost was immediate, as Pilgrim's systems overloaded, maintaining coherence against shifting rules, and the crew made the decision no algorithm could make, choosing to collapse their own null field permanently, anchoring the region at the expense of their return path. The ship broadcast a final packet, not of data, but of story fragments, memories, voices, laughter, fear, determination, and those fragments propagated through null space, seeding it with context that could not be easily erased. Across the galaxy, reality stabilized abruptly, and ships phased back into visibility in systems that had been fading, and billions of beings felt a sudden, inexplicable relief, as if a pressure they had never noticed was gone. Earth's sensors confirmed the anomaly had sealed, but at the cost of Pilgrim's disappearance, not into null space, but into a fixed absence that could not be traversed. Silence followed, not as shock, but as acknowledgement, because humanity understood sacrifice not as loss, but as continuity purchased at a price. The ancient machine issued a statement to all listening intelligences, declaring that the boundary had been renegotiated, and that from this point forward, absence would resist optimization that ignored subjective value, effectively making extinction by efficiency impossible. Empires reeled, because this change altered not just warfare, but evolution itself, privileging complexity and choice over simplification. Humanity did not claim credit publicly, but stories spread anyway, because stories always did, and the volunteers of Pilgrim became symbols not of dominance, but of guardianship. As Reconstruction began and treaties formed to govern null space collectively, a final signal emerged, faint but unmistakable from the sealed region, carrying a coherent echo that suggested Pilgrim had not been erased, but transformed into a fixed point within absence, a lighthouse rather than a ship. The implication was staggering, because it meant humanity had not just survived the boundary, but had left a permanent mark upon it. And as scientists debated and philosophers argued, one truth settled across the stars, that the line between reality and nothingness now remembered humanity, and that memory could not be undone. The galaxy did not return to what it had been, because history never reversed cleanly, and the sealing of the anomaly marked not an ending, but a redefinition of existence itself as absence gained memory, and reality gained a witness. In the weeks that followed, systems once considered marginal stabilized, and civilizations long on the brink found their probabilities bending subtly in their favor, as if the universe itself had adopted a bias toward persistence. Humanity did not announce stewardship, yet others began acting as if it were already assumed, because someone had to speak for the boundary, and the only species that had argued with it and survived was human. Earth's leaders resisted coronation, framing their role as participation rather than authority, but they could not deny that null space now responded differently to human presence, as if Pilgrim's sacrifice had etched a signature into the fabric of non-existence.
scientists discovered that transitions into null phase now carried echoes, fragments of narrative that resisted erasure and forced operators to maintain coherence not just mathematically, but ethically, because unstable intent produced unstable absence. This single change altered warfare irreversibly because it meant that disappearance without responsibility was no longer possible, and that those who stepped outside reality carried consequences back with them, whether they wished to or not. Empires that had relied on overwhelming force recalculated, while smaller civilizations found new leverage in alliances built around shared values rather than sheer power, and the ancient machine shifted its protocols from containment to cultivation, acknowledging that the universe had crossed a threshold where optimization could no longer ignore meaning. Humanity convened a gathering unlike any before, inviting not rulers but listeners, scientists, storytellers, engineers, and ethicists from across species lines. And the location was not a palace or station, but a stabilized null pocket shaped like a quiet horizon where presence and absence met without hostility. There, humans spoke plainly, explaining that they had never sought to master nothingness for domination, but for survival, and that survival had taught them something essential, that existence was not efficient, and that inefficiency was its strength because choice lived there. Those words spread because they resonated with civilizations tired of being measured solely by output and expansion, and a slow cultural shift began, valuing resilience, curiosity, and restraint as strategic assets rather than liabilities.
Meanwhile, exploration resumed cautiously as joint crews mapped null corridors, now laced with Pilgrim's echoes. And those echoes acted as anchors, preventing catastrophic drift. And each time a ship passed through, it felt less like trespassing and more like crossing a memorial. Stories of the volunteers circulated, not as myth, but as living guidance, reminding crews that courage did not require aggression and that sacrifice was not a failure mode, but a decision made when no other path preserved meaning. Somewhere deep within absence, Pilgrim persisted, transformed into a fixed narrative structure, neither ship nor station, but a constant reference point that balanced probabilities and occasionally emitted faint pulses interpreted by human instruments as laughter layered over static. And no one could prove it, but many felt the crew was still aware in some fashion, content to hold the line they had chosen. Alien admirals who once mocked human retreats revised their doctrines, and one in particular, the same who had whispered that humans did not hide but left reality, recorded a final addendum stating that humanity had returned with something no empire could manufacture: memory embedded in the void. As time passed, wars dwindled, not because conflict vanished, but because escalation encountered a boundary that remembered past excesses and refused to cooperate. And in that resistance, civilizations found incentive to resolve disputes before absence intervened. Humanity continued to underestimate itself, publicly emphasizing collaboration and humility, yet privately its people carried a quiet pride, knowing they had been underestimated too, and had answered not with annihilation, but with guardianship. For those listening to these accounts across the stars, the lessons settled slowly, that survival favored those who could step back from the brink, even after discovering how to erase it, and that power tempered by story endured longer than power alone. If you are hearing this narration now, it means the boundary still holds, and that someone before you chose to care enough to make it so. And those who share these stories keep that choice alive across time and space, reminding others that the universe listens not just to energy and matter, but to meaning.
The final truth recorded by the ancient machine before it returned to watchful silence was simple and unsettling, that humanity had not conquered absence, but had convinced it to remember, and in doing so ensured that reality itself would never forget who stood up when nothingness tried to decide for everyone.